Good morning and welcome to Winter Storytelling. I'm Molly Stockdale. I'm the Executive Director of Travelers Rest Connection. Most of you know me. I want to say hi to the folks who are on Zoom. And I'd like to begin today's program by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the homeland of the Selis people at a place they named Timsimclee. Their example as the original stewards of this land guides our work today. Travelers Rest Connection is committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through the ancient crossroads on this land. We learn from many indigenous artists, elders, and organizations. We invite you to learn from and support them as well. I want to say a quick thank you to everyone who makes these programs possible. The members of Travelers Rest Connection, everybody on Zoom who has made a donation at travelersrest.org. A special thank you today to Humanities Montana and their Montana Conversations program, which makes speakers like today's speaker available to us. And also a thank you to MCAT, Missoula's community media resource, who provided a media assistance grant to record Saturday storytelling each week this winter. The first 6 of our winter storytelling programs are now available on our website and on the MCAT website. We do not have Shirley Trahan's program because she told a coyote story, and as most of you know, those stories are only appropriate during storytelling months for the Salish people. So we'll have it archived and we'll put it up when it's more appropriate. But all the other programs are there for you. If you are joining us via Zoom this morning, it is helpful if you keep yourself muted and your video off during the presentation. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them in the chat box. Galen is here to monitor the chat and for any questions and to troubleshoot any technical difficulties you might have. We having any issues with sound?
Seems to be okay so far.
All right, all thumbs up, great. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. Christopher Preston teaches environmental philosophy at the University of Montana. His expertise revolves around the idea of the Anthropocene, the epoch in which human influence is everywhere. He studies emerging technologies for their impact on the human nature experience, as well as restoration and rewilding efforts. That's a hard one to say, rewilding. His award-winning book, The Synthetic Age, Outdesigning Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Reengineering Our World, has been translated into 6 languages. His latest book, Tenacious Beasts, Wildlife Recoveries That Change How We Think About Animals, offers hope for recovering species as well as lessons about how to live with them. Kristen.
We good? Okay, thank you, Molly. Thanks for Travelers Rest for having me here. I'm going to tell you stories of hope. I'm going to tell you positive stories, stories that I suggest, can make you feel good. And so these are stories about a resurgent wild. So we hear a lot about the wild getting destroyed, diminished, depleted on the way out. There's no end of negative stories about the wild. But I found a few positive ones. I'm going to tell you a few positive ones. And the heroes of these stories are what I call tenacious beasts. So the emblems of the resurgent wild are these tenacious beasts that come back against all the odds. And one of the tenacious beasts in my stories is the plains bison. And if you looked carefully at the background to this slide here, you will see a bison, and this is the artwork of Terry Dahl, who is a Blackfeet photographer and artist who directed the INI initiative at the Blackfeet Confederacy to bring bison back onto the landscape. I also brought with me Baxter. Baxter is my own personal bison, and it turned out that Baxter already has a friend here today. I don't know if Baxter's friend is named, but I brought Baxter because I like to travel with Baxter when I tell these positive stories. And of course, this is a great place to talk about bison because bison loomed large for Lewis and Clark. I looked it up in the records. They consumed 227 bison in the course of their travels. By the time they got here, they were sort of at the end of their bison feasting. It was a little barren of bison when they went west from here, but I understand when they came back, they were literally drooling at the mouth with the excitement of being back in bison country. At times they used bison skins to help frame out their boats. So bison loomed large for them. Geographically, we're also in a pretty interesting place to talk about bison, because if you just go 50 miles to the north of us here, on the Flatfeet lands up there, you've got the place where the first efforts to preserve bison took place. So Little Falcon Road, many of you will know this story, brought a half dozen bison over from what we call the Rocky Mountain front now, and kept them in the Flathead there, where they became one of the largest bison herds in the country around 1900. If you go 200 miles to the southeast of us, you've got Yellowstone, of course, where bison have continuously been through their loss and through their recovery. And then if you go 150 miles to the northeast of us, you've got something very interesting with bison. You've got where the Blackfeet have let bison loose now so that they can wander on and off Blackfeet land at will and up into Glacier National Park and up around Chief Mountain. So you've got these three sort of bison centers around us where lots of interesting stuff has happened with bison, lots of interesting stories, but really stories about recovery, stories about incredible recoveries. And so we're sort of at the epicenter of it. When bison were at their peak, they may have numbered about 60 million. And if you put 60 million bison nose to tail, they would lap the Earth 4 times. So at their peak, we're talking about a tremendous amount of bison. When bison were at their lowest, they were down to about 540, according to William T. Hornaday, and that's in the US and in Canada. And if you put 540 bison nose to tail, they would stretch from about here down to the Bitterroot River. So that's quite a depletion from 4 times around the Earth. But bison are tenacious beasts, and bison are recovering. There's now about 425,000 of them in the United States. If you put 425,000 bison nose to tail, they would stretch down to Mexico. So we're doing pretty well with bison, and bison are emblematic of tenacious beasts. Let me just give you a definition then. A tenacious beast goes close to extinction, looks extinction in the face, and then something happens, some policy changes, or some values change, or maybe some conservationists get very active on its recovery, and it starts to come back from extinction. So what makes you a tenacious beast is you've got super close to being wiped out, and then you come back. So my story is about tenacious beasts, and I gathered them in this book, and there's a few copies of it over there. Let me just give you sort of a sketch of the layout of the book. I organized it by landscape. So the first landscape in the book is prairies. And on prairies, my tenacious beasts are the bison, obviously. I've been mentioning those quite a bit. And the pronghorn, because the pronghorn have recovered from a low of about 13,000 around 1900 to about 1 million today. So pronghorn also count as tenacious beasts. There's a section on farmland. And as you can tell, my accent is not from here. Do you know where I'm from? Some people know where I'm from. I'm from England. So some of my tenacious beasts are from the European landscape. So this actually is the European wolf, and it's the red deer, which is a close relation of the elk. The European wolf is back to about 20,000 animals, and the red deer is in the millions again. So those also are tenacious beasts on farmland. On rivers, my favorite tenacious river beast is the beaver. The beaver's back up to about 15 million now from a low of about 100,000. And I have a tenacious beast who I want to come back, and that's the salmon. And the salmon is still struggling, but there are pockets of hope and excitement that I tracked in the story. So that's rivers. Forests, so we bop back over to Europe again here, and to the left there is the second rarest brown bear species in the world. So it's a subspecies called the Mexican brown bear. And for about a century, there's been only 50 of them. There's now about 70 or 80. So it's still a bit precarious, but if you like numbers, that's a 40 to 60% increase. So that makes them a tenacious beast. The only rarer type of brown bear is the goby bear. I think there's literally just a couple of dozen of those. But the Mexican bear is very rare. And on the right there is the barred owl that is flourishing. In fact, flourishing too well. And the story I tell there is about that tenacious beast, which is causing problems for a different tenacious beast, the spotted owl. Oceans, that's the last landscape I talk about. And on oceans, I get into some stories of whales, and I'll mention a couple of them later today. And I talk about sea otters. And sea otters, originally they numbered about 300,000. Their range is from California all the way up that Pacific coast, around the Ring of Fire and over to Japan. They were 300,000. They were reduced to about 1,000. And then now back up to 125,000. So in every case, you've got some pretty good stories of animals either fully recovered or partway recovered or creeping back up, or at least with the potential to recover. And so these are all stories of hope, stories that are supposed to make us feel good. Now, my biggest nightmare when I talk about this book and about this topic is that I'm going to start telling these tales, and I'm going to get a biologist stand up and say, "Don't give me all this optimism. The picture is bleak. Haven't you heard about climate change?" And I worry about that, because I shouldn't stand here and say, "Oh, I've got these great wildlife stories," when the overall picture is actually one that's a little more worrying. But why do I think it's worth telling this story? Well, the first reason is that there's more of these species out there than you think. So in the book, I gather about 15, but then there's other ones that I don't talk about in the book. In the top left, we got the golden jackal in Europe. We got the grizzly bear in the top right. We got the trumpeter swan. We got the bald eagle. The bald eagle has gone from about 400 nesting pairs to 70,000 nesting pairs. I mean, it's really kind of a remarkable recovery. The northern elephant seal in the bottom left has gone from about 100 animals to 175,000 animals. And the river otter in the middle there is in the San Francisco Bay area. It hadn't been there for decades. So there's quite a lot of these stories out there. And so perhaps the first reason is to say, there is hope. There is hope. Things are bleak, but there really is hope. And as a teacher at the university, I think for the first decade or so of my career, I thought my job was to persuade students how bleak everything was. You need to worry about this stuff before you get your degree and go out there in the world. I'm not sure that is my job actually anymore. I think that was maybe a mistake. I think my job really is to give students a vision and a sense of possibility, and an idea of how they might help make the world better. And so if I tell these more positive stories, I think that's a much better thing to be doing as an educator than just telling them how grim their future looks. So hope is the first reason to tell the stories. The second reason, I think, is to just remember how biology works. And what I mean by that is something very simple. And it's this: animals want to live. Animals want to live. What have they done over time? They've exploited environments, they've used wisdom buried in their genes to find living strategies, like ways of being in the world, ways of behavior that allow them to live and reproduce. That's kind of built into their DNA, literally. They want to live. So if we give them a chance, they might surprise us with just how much they want to live and how well they can recover. And I think when COVID happened, you remember we all got sort of locked inside and we were all kind of frightened about what was going to happen. We were delighted at how animals started showing up. And so there were these Welsh goats in villages in Wales. There were these Mexican brown bears that I mentioned. They were bathing in fountains in Italy. There were pumas in San Diego. Animals came back and surprised us. They're kind of waiting in the wings, waiting for a chance to come back. And that's how biology works. So I wanted to tell these stories to remind people that give them a chance, and they can take that chance. And then finally, so I'm a philosopher. I teach environmental philosophy, which means, what does that mean? It means I think about the environment a lot, right? I think about the environment. And some of these stories I realized, and I only realized as I was researching these stories and as I was putting them together. Some of these stories make us think again about these animals, have different thoughts about these animals. So imagine an animal that's been gone for a century. What are the stories you hear about that animal? Well, you hear the ones that were told a century ago, because those are the stories that kind of built up and became the dominant narrative when that animal was being wiped out. Roll on the clock 100 years or so. We've got different situations that we live in. We've got different science. We've got different coping strategies. We've got different values. We've got different people. So let's update our stories. Let's update how we think about animals. And so let's use these stories of resurgence to come up with a better concept of certain animals. So that's kind of my motivation for writing this book. What I want to do, excuse me, next is tell you just a few of the little details of some of the chapters. I want to kind of run through some of the case studies. And I want to perhaps answer the question, if we want these handful of recoveries to spread, what do we have to do? So through these case studies, I want to draw for us some lessons. So let's take, for example, these three, and these are three that we can all relate to in Montana, I think. The plains bison, Castor canadensis, the beaver, and the wolf, Canis lupus. What strategy do you have to adopt for these animals to come back? Here's the answer. Stop killing them. And I know it sounds kind of trite, and it sounds kind of like I'm being facetious or something like that. But I do think this is an important lesson. There are some animals where if you stop killing them, they come back. And that's the case on the right here, and it's also the case here. I said I have one chapter on whales. But the story of the recovery of the humpback whale is really astonishing. A moratorium on the hunting of humpback whales was put in place in 1966. In 1986, the International Whaling Commission extended that to a moratorium on all commercial whaling for signatories to that treaty. Not every country signed it, but most did. Since 1966, when that moratorium on humpback whales was placed, those humpbacks have come back to 95% of the population before whaling. Okay? And just to put some concrete numbers on that, the North Pacific population of humpback whales, which is the one closest to us here, went from about 1,200 humpbacks to where it stands now, which is about 24,000 humpbacks. The North Atlantic population, which is closer to where I was born in the UK, and those whales kind of go from the Caribbean and the Azores, and they go all the way up to northern Norway. That population has gone from around 1,000 to about 30,000 today. And the Western Indian Ocean population, this is the most staggering number. The Western Indian Ocean population has gone from 600 animals to perhaps 36,000. And what did we have to do? We had to just stop killing them. That was it. We didn't have to do anything else. We just had to stop killing them. They know how to live in the ocean. They've been doing it for 50 million years. And so one strategy I learned through several of these animals is if you stop killing them, they come back. Here's another strategy. I'm in Italy, and those folks on the top left, you can see what they're doing. They're pruning apple trees. And they're pruning apple trees because they want to create fruit on those trees for these rare Marsican bears I was talking about. And this is an interesting one for us in western Montana because I bet some of you have got apple trees in your yards. And in the fall, when bears are entering that hyperphagia phase and they're just trying to eat anything they can, you're probably told to pull those apples off that tree and certainly pick them up off the ground and maybe even electrify the apple orchard if you have an apple orchard. Here we're encouraged not to let the bears eat those apples. But there, they want the bears to eat their apples. Why? Because the apples are a little bit out of town. They're in the hills. They're a result of agriculture that has now been abandoned. And those bears stand a better chance if they're up in the hills eating those apples than if they're down in the villages looking for chickens, risking their lives, crossing the roads, getting beekeepers angry at them. And so it's better for these bears to be eating apples in the foothills than getting in trouble in the towns. And there's the proof that it works. There's a bear, a Moscow brown bear, one of only those 70 or so that are left, climbing one of those apple trees to eat some of those apples. And the enthusiasm with which these volunteers go at this, so these are all volunteers doing this work, the enthusiasm is infectious. And I went there with a guy called Mario Cipollone, who works full-time for this organization, Save the Bear. And he showed me the trees, he showed me some of the fencing that they're doing, he showed me some of the places where he'd seen bears actually just the week before. And of course I was hoping I would see a Marsican bear, second rarest brown bear in the world. Didn't see a Marsican bear, but I did see some of its poop. And Mario and I, and there were about 5 or 6 of us in the group at the time, came upon some Marsican bear poop on the trail. These bears are in the forest, so it's an oak beech forest. And we came upon it, and just a stunned silence fell. And we stood around in a circle and looked at the poop on the ground. And after we just sort of absorbed the significance of this very rare poop, Mario picked up a couple of sticks and went down, put the poop between the sticks, and brought it up towards his nose like this. And I thought, this is now becoming a little strange. But he brought it up to his nose, closed his eyes, took a deep breath in, and then he breathed out, and he opened his eyes and smiled, and he said, "He's like a fine wine." It was such a lovely moment for me. I mean, it was so lovely because it wasn't just an animal, you know, it was part of the culture for him. And you know how seriously Italians take their wine. And we talked afterwards at length about how for him these bears were so culturally important. And of course, you know, we hear that a lot over here when we talk about indigenous peoples and indigenous relationships to animals. But I was hearing it from an Italian living in a country of 60 million people in a landscape smaller than Montana's. And he was saying that these bears were part of the culture for him. So it was just a really powerful, interesting moment for me. So sometimes you just leave the animal alone, it comes back. Other times you have to prune apple trees for it. Other times you have to make restaurants for them. And so these are the griffon vultures, also in Europe actually. And these griffon vultures are recovering strong. They've been down to about 3,000. They're back up to about 30,000. So they definitely count as a tenacious beast. These griffon vultures, they don't predate on anything. They scavenge, as all vultures do. And of course, their being wiped out through poisoning and killing by livestock owners was a giant mistake because they weren't killing anything. They were scavenging things. As some of the larger herbivore populations in Europe were wiped out, these vultures had problems because there wasn't much to scavenge anymore, so they started scavenging on livestock. Dead livestock, right? Not killing livestock, but scavenging on dead livestock. This caused hostility. And also European regulations told the livestock owners not to leave livestock around because it would foster disease. And so suddenly the vultures, having no more wild herbivores, no more domestic scavenging to do, when they started coming back, they didn't have enough food. So you have to put food out for them in these vulture restaurants. And as a result of that, they're starting to come back. Now, also the good news is that the wildlife populations are starting to come back. So I mentioned the red deer coming back. The wild boar in Europe are coming back. The roe deer are coming back. And so slowly, if these vulture restaurants are just kind of like a bridge, then hopefully as those wild herbivores come back in Europe, and some of the wild predators in Europe, the wolf, for example, these vultures they'll be able to make it on their own. So things are looking up for them too. But again, this is another step where we have to kind of intervene a little bit. I got to tell you just this little bit about these sperm whales very quickly. Sperm whales were reduced by about 75%, so from about 2 million down to about 500,000. They're now back up to about 850,000. That's good. Not so good if you're a longline fisherman off Alaska. Because if you're a longline fisherman, I don't know if you're familiar with longlining, but you put a long line of hooks on the bottom of the ocean, baited, and that line can be a mile or more long, and you can have hooks on it every 6 to 8 feet. And then after leaving that line soaking on the bottom of the ocean, you kind of slowly winch it back up on the boat through hydraulic winches. These sperm whales that are getting more numerous, they're smart. So sperm whales actually have the largest brain of any animal on Earth. And sperm whales hear those hydraulic winches, whee, and that sound travels through the water, and they come running. And they've been tracked coming from 10 miles away. When they arrive at the boat, I want you to try and visualize what they see. They look up and they see the hull of the boat up there. They see the long line on the bottom of the ocean down there. And between the two, they see this moving sushi belt of fish. And so they're watching this and they're just taking bites off of this sushi belt of fish. There's one technique they use apparently which is called flossing. So a sperm whale has it's a toothed whale, so there's baleen whales and toothed whales. It has a lower jaw with teeth on it. So the flossing technique is that the sperm whale will come up to that line, will hook its lower jaw under the line and let the line floss its teeth. And then every so often you can imagine a fish is on the line and it feels a little bump and it just goes, and it chomps down on the fish. Flossing. And of course, if you're a fisherman, this is half your catch, sometimes 2/3 or 3/4 of your catch, just going straight down the gullet of the sperm whale. And I asked somebody who was a specialist in this, they call it depredation. And she says, the fishermen are not that mad. I mean, surprisingly, they kind of understand the whales need to be out here, and they're kind of happy to see them back. They just want it to be that the whales don't take the fish after they've caught the fish. And so they've kind of worked out a solution to it, which is it's kind of interesting. It's not to fish with hooks, but to fish with baskets, essentially. So these are like string baskets, and you put the bait in the basket, and the fish that they're after, which usually a black cod, will go into the basket after the bait, and they can't get out. And then the whale sees this basket going up, and he's like, well, I can't get the fish now because it's protected within this basket. So anyway, another piece of adaptation, and these sperm whales continue to come back. I want to give you another bison story, but this is not a bison story from here. This is a bison story from Europe. So bison in Europe, it's a different species, Bison bonasus, not bison. Bison bonasus was down to a low point of about 50 animals, of which 12 were taken for breeding, and from those 12, those bison are now back up to about 7,500. And those bison have been reintroduced very close to where I grew up. So this was in southeastern England. And this is a forest, it's about 30 minutes from where my sister currently lives. So I've been following this story for the last 2 years. Those bison have been back there for, it's now 14 months. They've had 2 calves born in those 14 months. One of them was an immaculate conception. Which was very strange, because what they did, so the first bison they brought back were 3 females. And they thought, so these bison are matriarchal, as they are with plains bison, and they thought, let's just let the kind of older female kind of figure things out, and the 2 younger females will watch the older female. And we'll have a few months of just the females kind of doing their thing, and then we'll bring the bull bison in. During those few months, one of those females gave birth. And it gave them kind of a big shock because they thought they'd done enough testing to know that, there was no young bison on the way. I asked the ranger to explain this to me. So this guy was the first bison ranger in the UK. There hadn't been bison in the UK for 30,000 years. So he was the first bison ranger for 30,000 years, which, that's kind of an honor. And I said, come on, explain this to me. How did you have a pregnant bison there and none of you knew it? And he said, well, think about it, right? If you're a bison, you want to hide your pregnancy. You want to not show it at all, if possible, because otherwise you're just easy prey for predators. Now, of course, in England, they didn't have to worry about predators. There wasn't any predator who was going to eat these bison, but of course the adaptation stays with the bison. And so this female was not showing, and hence they were surprised by the birth of a bison calf. They then introduced the male, which was in December of last year, I guess. So actually the females have been there longer than 14 months. They then introduced the male, and they've had another pregnancy, and the herd is now growing. Now, it's an interesting story. It's interesting for me personally because when I grew up in England, the biggest animal I ever saw was a rabbit. Since then, deer have made a recovery, so the biggest animal my sister's children see have been deer, but now the biggest animal my sister's children can see are 2,000-pound bison, which is pretty exciting. But what happens when you put a 2,000-pound bison into the English countryside? We don't have places like the Prairie or Yellowstone. What happens is you have to put fences around them. And so there are 2 fences around this area where these bison are. There is a 3-foot fence with an electric wire on it, and that fence is adequate to keep the bison contained. So it's not a big deal. It's just like a 3-foot fence with an electric wire on the top. But about 8 feet outside of that, there is a 6-foot metal fence with barbed wire on the top, and that's to keep the people out. Because interestingly, and this will have to change, a bison by law in England is categorized as a dangerous wild animal. So if you had, for example, a pet boa constrictor or a pet tiger in England, you would need this license for a dangerous wild animal. If you put bison back in the forest, you need a license for a dangerous wild animal, which is odd because it is a native animal. But they're so unused to having animals that big in England that it has to be categorized differently. And to be fair, it's about 6 miles from Canterbury. This is Canterbury Cathedral. And I don't know if we're quite ready for bison to be roaming the grasses outside of Canterbury Cathedral. So I get it, but all of the rangers said to me, this has got to change. This can't be how we think of these native animals. So you can see each of these stories has a sort of difficult, complicated way of adapting to the animal. On the one extreme there is do nothing, stop killing it, and it'll come back. And then there's feed it with a vulture restaurant, put an electric fence around it, keep the people out, prune the apple trees. I was hoping there would be one thing that you had to do to help animals recover, but there's actually 1,000 different things depending upon the species. And the one that I think is most interesting, perhaps most ethically provocative, is this one. So these are northern spotted owls. And I mentioned the flourishing owl. That's the barred owl. And the barred owl is wreaking havoc on these northern spotted owl populations. And so in this case, if you want these northern spotted owls to come back, it turns out you have to shoot barred owls. And this has been studied extensively, and when I was writing this book, I was right on the tail end of a study which was taking place in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, where they were shooting barred owls in certain forests. So I went out in the forest near Clay Elum with somebody who'd been involved in that process. The study has finished. They've concluded that it does help save the northern spotted owl. So if you do remove barred owls from the parts of the forest the spotted owl is in, it does help those spotted owls to survive. And official Fish and Wildlife Service policy now is to encourage the shooting over the next decade of up to 500,000 of these barred owls. And when we talk about how much intervention is the right amount of intervention to keep a species alive, this brings it, I think, to its most dramatic extreme. Should we be shooting one species to keep another species alive? And I talked extensively. The person who I went out in the forest with was called Melissa Hunt, which was an interestingly appropriate name for someone who's out there shooting barred owls. And I said, what do you think, Melissa? Seriously, you've been doing this for 5 years. Do you have any kind of feeling of guilt or doubt about whether this is the right thing? And she said, well, I certainly have, feelings that it's controversial. She says, I admire these barred owls. I know how well they're doing on this landscape and how difficult they are to remove from the landscape. So she says, I certainly admire them. And she said, I have friends who've told me that what I'm doing is wrong and is controversial. She said, I've had friends ask me, are you a member of Al Qaeda? And she says, yeah, funny, right? That's not funny. She doesn't like it when they say that, but she accepts that this is what they need to do. And so she says, it's a simple choice. If you want spotted owls, you've got to kill barred owls. There's no other way to do it. And I called up the scientist who was running the study, Dave Wiens at Oregon State University, and he said basically, there's other strategies, none of them are effective. The only effective strategy is to kill the barred owls. So there's a range of things. You've got to be a pragmatist. There's no one-size-fits-all with animal recovery. And that's what's so fascinating. You find different stories, you find different people, you find different histories. Each case was just so intriguing to look into. So many sort of characters I met, so much passion. One of the things one of the lessons I took away, I think, is that we think of scientists as being dispassionate and objective. But most of these scientists had a deep, deep love for the species that they were investigating. Like the work they did was work motivated by the heart. And some of the problems and challenges were challenges that really are very tricky moral challenges. When animals come back, they do create inconveniences for people. And so we have to wrestle with those too. So those were the stories in terms of some of the details and some of the people. I want to, in the last few minutes here, and how many minutes would you say I have, Molly?
10 and then
10
time for questions? Is that
okay, I think I can do it in 10. So do you remember the third reason to write this book? It was to say, how can we think differently about animals? When they come back, how can we look at them afresh with 2024 eyes and not 1902 eyes? And how can we think about them differently? So I want to talk about some examples of thinking about animals differently. So I mentioned the beaver. Beaver's coming back well. There's a beaver dam at Milltown Dam State Park over there. Interesting thing to notice about a beaver dam at Milltown Dam State Park, one dam comes out and other dams come in. That's interesting. The human-built dam goes out, the beaver-built dams go in. This is up here, up Highway 12, near Howard Creek, where I went with a scientist from who is studying how does a beaver dam change the hydrology of a landscape. So this isn't a great photo, you can't see it very well, but there's a small artificial beaver dam been put in there. And what they were doing when I was up there with them was measuring the hydrology and sort of figuring out what it does to the water table and also what it does to carbon sequestration and methane emissions and fish passage and all these sorts of things. So they were studying it. This was a PhD dissertation. And so what's happening? The recovery is giving us a chance to learn from beavers. And we're so convinced that beavers are pretty good for ecosystem recovery that there's a whole industry now of building these fake beaver dams called beaver dam analogs, where we trust the beaver skills to bring the ecosystem back. Now, I put to you, this is a different way to think about beavers. not as sort of annoying rodents that flood the landscape, but as valuable assistants in ecosystem recovery. And so I think we can look at beavers now and we can recognize that they are an expert of a certain kind. And I don't think in 1920 or in 1880 you would find many people saying beavers are experts. You probably would find that in indigenous communities perhaps, but you would not, that would not be a common view outside of that ecosystem. So I think beaver recovery allows you to think of beavers as experts. Let's go back to these bison. This last summer, I was out at American prairie landscape and they wanted to show me a couple of streams. Here's a stream where cattle have been removed and bison have been back for a couple of years. Here's a stream where cattle have been removed and bison have been back for about 8 or 10 years. And look how green it is. When we showed up at this creek, this is called, ironically, Beaver Creek, there was a flight of 8 pelicans took off. There were 2 night herons and 1 great blue heron. All took off from this. And this was August. And the previous day it had been 102 degrees. And so this creek has standing water in it. And how does it do that? Well, the bison don't need to spend a lot of time wallowing in the creek and tearing the vegetation out when it gets hot. Bison are heat adapted. And so they go to the creek to drink, but then they leave the creek, allowing the vegetation to keep doing its thing, and the vegetation starts to recover. It starts to recover so well that at Beaver Creek, we saw a beaver dam. And it was fun because Danny Kinker, who's the ecologist for American Prairie, hadn't seen that dam before. And he said, look, there's a beaver dam right there. And the thing he pointed out to me right away is this beaver dam is made entirely of mud and rushes. There's not a single tree in it. And so this creek has not recovered enough yet for the cottonwoods and the willows to resprout, but they're on the way. And when those cottonwoods and willows resprout, you're going to get beavers making dams out of twigs. They're going to look more like the one that I showed you that photo of over there. But these bison are doing something. In these hot, dry summers, these bison are helping these landscapes recover. They're keeping water on the landscape, and they're creating the space in which beavers can operate. So given that the future in eastern Montana, and western Montana for that fact, is going to be one of increasing heat, why not look at the bison as climate allies? This is a contemporary, I think, potentially helpful way to look at bison as climate allies. And let's not stop at bison if we're looking for climate allies. Those sea otters that are coming back, you know how they help kelp forests regrow? They eat the invertebrates that eat the kelp forests. So when you bring a sea otter back, the invertebrate populations go down, the kelp forests come back. The kelp forests, like all forests, take carbon out of the atmosphere. You know those whales? They help take carbon out of the atmosphere too. They spread nutrients around the ocean, and this is basically a product of feeding and pooping. Feeding in one place, pooping in another. Pooping also close to the surface. And if you poop close to the surface, you provide fertilizer for the ocean and for those phytoplankton. Those phytoplankton grow, they pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So we can look at those sea otters, those bison, those whales as climate allies. And here's my last example of an animal that is going to change how we think about them. And I always hesitate before talking about this animal, but I do think the lesson is worth it. So obviously there's hardly any wildlife species more vilified than the wolf. Beasts of waste and desolation, said Theodore Roosevelt about these guys. But these animals are coming back well. I mean, we know that story in Montana as well as anybody knows that story. We all know about the wolves being restored to Yellowstone in 1995. We're not quite as aware of the fact that at the same time as 66 wolves were being brought back to Yellowstone and the Frank Church River of No Return to the south of us here, about 75 wolves were already back in Montana, and they'd made their own way down from Glacier. And so there was actually controversy about whether we needed to put them in Yellowstone because they were making their own way back. Wolves travel. You remember in December of last year, wolves were brought back into Colorado, but they were already making their way into Colorado. They were showing up on their own 4 paws. And interestingly, The wolf recovery in Arizona and New Mexico, which is a different subspecies of wolf, the Mexican gray wolf, that recovery is starting to take off too, and those wolves are starting to traveling north from New Mexico into Colorado. And so you've got gray wolves coming down into Colorado from the north. You've got Mexican gray wolves going up into Colorado from the south. We're going to have some interesting things happen. And let me show you this little video. Look at this video closely. It's going to play twice. There's two wolves in this video. They're going to trot across the screen, and then they're going to trot across the screen again. And ask yourself, are these the same subspecies of wolf? What do you think? They're different, aren't they? They are different. And these are not actually Northern Rocky Mountain wolves and Mexican gray wolves. These are in Europe again. These are Italian wolves and Eurasian wolves that are now flourishing enough that they're breeding again. Those two subspecies are breeding again for the first time in a couple hundred years. So wolves are travelers. Wolves cross boundaries. And in Europe, here's a wolf that's crossed a boundary. So we're in the Netherlands here. We're just on some farmland. Those are the two provinces in the Netherlands. It's so dog-like, isn't it? I mean, it's just kind of incredible. Wolves cross boundaries, they travel. Why I wanted to show you that little bit of the wolf on the farm there is that there the wolf is not just crossing a geographical boundary from New Mexico to Colorado or from Italy into Slovenia. It's crossing a conceptual boundary from the wolf in the wild, in the wilderness, to the wolf on the farm. And wolves are experts in crossing these boundaries. But should that be much of a surprise? Because surely if any animal has crossed from the wild into the domestic, it's the wolf, right? Because a lot of us have wolves in our houses. Kind of wolves, right? Not real wolves, but kind of wolves. We have descendants of wolves. But wolves aren't the only animals that cross boundaries, because this photo was taken on move-in day at UM 2 falls ago, where we had a black bear crossing the boundary of Arthur Street onto campus. And there's a student who's just probably bought their books at the bookstore. Maybe they were books for my class, I don't know. But here's this wolf crossing that boundary. And this is last September in Missoula. These wolves, I always say wolves when I mean bears. These are bears on campus having crossed that boundary from the wild into the civilized. So that's really sort of where I want to end the talk today, is to say some animals are back. There's not one strategy that brings them all back. They come back in different ways, in different places, for different reasons, involving different techniques and different ways of looking at them. But they can come back, and their coming back is an opportunity, certainly an opportunity for them, but I think also an opportunity for us, an opportunity to think about wildlife differently, and to think about how we can tell better stories, maybe, more positive stories, stories of coexistence, stories that are kind, stories that are fair to people who have to live with the challenges that some of these animals bring, but stories in which all sorts of forms of life can flourish. So thanks for listening, and I'll try to answer any questions if you have them.
Repeat the question when it's asked to you so the folks on Zoom can hear it.
Okay.
Holly?
Yes.
Can you talk about the populations of the barred owl and the spotted owl right now?
So the barred owl, I think there are at least 2 million barred owls in the United States. And there are, in British Columbia, there are less than 6 spotted owls. In Oregon, there are a few hundred, maybe. I mean, it's like a gross imbalance. In British Columbia, they've actually started bringing them in to captive breed them and then release them back out. It hasn't been very successful yet. One of the biologists that I read about said spotted owls in the Northwest are circling the drain. And one other thing I would add about that story, barred owls used to be confined to the East Coast. And so they weren't a problem for spotted owls because they weren't in spotted owl territory. But they made it across the country when settlers changed the landscape enough that they had enough trees in the Great Plains to kind of hopscotch through various generations across the country. So it's a problem that we caused, and it's a problem where the numbers just look devastating for spotted owls.
So I'm asking a hard question. So how can we as average citizens help build awareness of the importance of ecosystems with policymakers and legislators?
Yes, sorry, I forgot to repeat that previous question. How can we as citizens create awareness to influence policymakers and legislatures on the importance of ecosystems? Well, one thing that I think has not worked is saying, the situation is bleak, we're facing a crisis, we have to do something about this crisis. Because no one is, well, people are not often motivated by crises. I have come to think that people are motivated by positive stories and stories of overcoming challenges. And so these tenacious beasts are beasts that have overcome challenges. There's another element to it as well. You have to overcome some of the social challenges involved in bringing these animals back. With those bears in Italy, there's the pruning of the apples, okay, but there's also a whole lot of people work going on. Going into villages, handing out literature, helping shepherds who are faced with predation from increasing populations of, in Italy, wolves and bears. Helping shepherds by providing sheepdogs, for example. They're also helping shepherds by providing vaccinations to the dogs to make sure there aren't diseases getting spread. So stories of hope where you tell the story of what the animal can do, which with luck that will create admiration and inspiration, but you also tell stories of how you can overcome the challenges, how you can make it work for different people who are going to face challenges. But I guess I'll say one more thing about those challenges. We have to be clear-eyed about the nature of whatever threat or difficulty that reintroduced animal brings. And so, in Europe, there is quite a bit of conversation now about wolves preying on sheep. So, in Europe, you're more likely, we don't have so much ranching in Europe, but we have a lot of sheep and a lot of shepherding. The percentage of the European sheep flock that is lost to wolves each year is 0.065. The percentage of the Montana cattle, the total Montana cattle numbers killed by wolves each year, and these are Montana Bureau of Livestock numbers, is 0.0016. And I bring those numbers up because I became very self-conscious about standing up in front of people saying, isn't it great, all these animals are recovering, and I'm from Europe as well, and so obviously I feel a little self-conscious about standing up and saying that in front of an American audience. So I looked at those numbers and I said, well, all right, we hear a lot about the problem here. How big is the problem? And I think those numbers, 0.065 for sheep in Europe and 0.0016 for cattle in Montana, they say something about how big the problem is. Now, to be clear, if you are the cattle owner who is losing those cattle or losing those sheep, that can lead to financial ruin for you. So I am in no way wanting to diminish how serious that is if you are the person facing that problem. But when you zoom back and look at it on a national or a continent-wide or a statewide level, It gives you a clear-eyed sense of the size of the problem and how one might be able to address that with, resources being allocated in ways that help people who suffer the consequences of these animal recoveries.
Tom?
If it's 0.0016 in Montana, what does that equal in a raw number?
Yes, so what does 0.0016 is the number of cattle killed in Montana by wolves each year. What is that as a raw number? So there's just over 2 million cattle in Montana, and so the confirmed number of wolf kills in 2022, when I got that number, 0.0016, was 35.
We have a question from Zoom, which is, have the grizzlies recovered enough for delisting, in your opinion? Sorry.
That is such a difficult question. So grizzly numbers in Yellowstone Park, they were down to about 150 or so in the 70s. They're now in the park, maybe up around 500-600 in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, maybe around 700-800 in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, over 1,000. There's probably 2,000 or so grizzlies in the United States. That's excluding Alaska, where there's obviously a lot more. I am going to avoid the question of whether that is enough to delist, because there are complexities about what the future of the grizzly is, with ecosystems changing due to climate change and food sources shifting and all that sort of thing. I will say, however, that it is important for the Endangered Species Act to show that it can work. And so there are cases where if an animal is listed and it has recovered, I feel like it should come off the list eventually. And so I think there's still a debate about whether the grizzly bear is at that point when it should come off the list. But I think those who are on either side of this debate need to recognize that the Endangered Species Act is there to play a role temporarily. That's the idea of the act, is you get an animal through the crisis, and then when it's out the other side, you delist it. And I think that's as far as I want to go on that topic. Yes, at the
I
back.
have another question. Do you have any awareness of or research involved with the University of Wisconsin and the orcas in the Puget Sound?
So the question is about orcas in Puget Sound. So I don't know that research in particular, but what I do know, one of the stories that I didn't talk about today was salmon and dam removals. So salmon, if you remove dams, can show themselves to be tenacious beasts. The dams that came off of the Elwha River, the two dams that came off around 2012, have led to the recovery of the coho population of salmon in the Elwha River, and a mild recovery of the Chinook salmon in the Elwha River. And as a result of that recovery, the southern resident orcas that live in parts of Puget Sound have started showing up at the mouth of the Elwha to eat those salmon. So the Elwha was known for these giant hogs, they called them. Salmon so big that if you held one on your shoulder, its tail would slap along the ground behind you. And if you can bring those salmon back through things like dam removal on the Elwha, you at least give the orcas a fighting chance. There's a lot more that has to happen, but it's a step in the right direction where one recovery can spawn several other recoveries.
I have a question about reintroducing bison into native areas. How curated are those beasts in terms of DNA? Because I've read, that it's part of the original herd, or that they're bringing them back. Because the option is like crossbred.
Yes, super interesting question. When we're talking about reintroducing bison, what do we say about their DNA? How much do we need to know? And what's going on with these bison? Are they pure bison? So it's a fascinating story, and it is one that I tell in that book, in the Prairie chapter. So those bison that I mentioned were brought into the Flathead from the Rocky Mountain front. They grew in the Flathead into a herd of about 800, and that herd, the Pablo Allard herd, was eventually sold to Canada. that herd was known as probably one of the most genetically pure herds alongside the Yellowstone herd. And a lot of the reintroductions on reservations and in the United States in the last decade or so have been from that Canadian herd. And so it's actually thought that 4/5 of all of the bison in conservation herds in the United States, so that this means bison at the bison range, for example. It means bison in Wind Cave. It means bison on tribal reservations. 4/5 of those bison are descended from those bison that came across from the Rocky Mountain front into the Flathead, became the Pablo Allard herd, went up to Canada, and now have come back. When I was writing the book, it was thought that the Yellowstone bison and those bison were genetically pure. Since I have written the book, there's been a paper published suggesting that even those bison have some cattle genes in them. And the thought there is that when they were in the Flathead area, there was some interbreeding with cattle. And when the Yellowstone herd was at its lowest, the Yellowstone herd was down to about 20 animals in the early 1900s. When the Yellowstone herd was at its lowest, it was supplemented by a handful of bison from up here and a bison or two from Texas. There was a rancher named Charles Goodnight who had some bison. The Yellowstone herd was supplemented with Pablo Allard bison and with Goodnight bison, and it is thought that cattle genes got into the Yellowstone herd from those two introductions, which is super interesting. So I posed the question to Terry Dahl. So you remember Terry is the person whose art was on the first slide. I said to Terry, I said, all right, what's your view on cattle genes in bison? And she said, as far as I'm concerned, if a bison looks like a bison, if it acts like a bison, if it plays a cultural role that the bison can play, I don't care. And she said this issue of genetic purity is one that the Western scientists get very wound up about. And she said, I don't think that we get as wound up about it up here. So that was kind of interesting for me, because I was chasing down this question of genetic purity the whole time I was doing the research. And then I was told not to worry about it so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm curious, in your capacity as a professor at the university, are you talking in your classes about the restoration of the bison to the Blackfeet? And the other part of the question is, are there any Blackfeet taking your classes out of interest in that topic?
So the question is, does this come into my classes, and do I have a tribal audience in my class? Is that what you're asking?
Sure.
Yeah.
Interest.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I feel like such a novice in this that I would not like to be talking about bison reintroduction in a tribal sorts of context. I mean, everything I wrote in the book about the tribes and the bison, I learned from tribal people. I mean, they have been restoring bison from the beginning. And this is actually a point that I make in the book is, if you ask most people, when did bison recovery begin? People would probably say, well, the American Bison Society was formed in 1905 by William Hornaday and President Roosevelt. 1905, Little Falcon Robe brought those bison across from the Rocky Mountain front into the Flathead in the 1870s. And the Pablo Allard herd was at 800 bison by about the 1890s. This is to say, the tribes are the original bison restorers. I talk to my students about these stories because they're interesting stories, and they sort of help us think about possibilities and also help us think about matters of justice, matters of social justice. So this is sort of a rambling answer to the question. You know, I do talk about this in my classes, but this is not something I'm in a position to sort of, I'm not in a position to claim any expertise or knowledge about this. The stories I've heard that inspire me, and I do want to relay those on, yeah.
Yes, what?
I'm worried about management of wildlife that are on the brink and restoration, but I feel that those management policies have to be based with good science and not politics. And that's my big worry, especially with the grizzly and the wolverine, for examples.
So the question is about, can we do scientific management and not politically based management? The idea that science can take place completely insulated from politics is a noble hope, but I think it's a vain hope. There's always politics in science because science requires funding, it requires permissions and permits. Science is always influenced to some degree by politics. We try and keep them as separate as possible, and the best science is as separated as possible from politics. But I think it's almost impossible to keep them entirely separate. And you can see it here in Montana again and again in questions about the wolf, questions about the grizzly bear. I mean, one interesting question about the grizzly bear and delisting, for example, is there sufficient gene flow between the northern continental divide ecosystem and the Yellowstone ecosystem? So those systems have both got decent numbers of bears in them right now, but is there enough genetic diversity? To get genetic diversity, you would need those systems to be exchanging genes. So far, as far as we know, there are not bears moving between those two. But according to some views, it's an adequate way to get that gene flow is to put a few bears on a truck in one of those ecosystems and drive them into the other ecosystem and let them loose. And so by moving them in a truck, you create that gene flow. You can imagine that being a political issue. Does that really count as gene flow, or does that count as faking it? Or should we be sticking habitat together so those bears can actually make it from Yellowstone to Glacier? And you can see that there's politics in that discussion, the way it's playing out. I wish there weren't, but I think the hope that the politics is going to disappear is a hope that is very hard to satisfy, unfortunately.
So a lot of the animals that you are talking about traditionally have pretty wide ranges and, like you've mentioned, travel fairly far. Is there enough space for them to thrive in a world where we have constructed so much urban sprawl and roads and fences? And you've talked about how that travel has made it so that they need that travel in order to get that genetic integration and such. Do we have enough state to state cross communication in order for one project to be happening in one state and they know perhaps this travel is going to happen to another state? How does that cross communication work? Do we have enough community and space and agreements between different peoples in order to make this work?
Okay, so the question is, if animals roam, if animals need a lot of space, do we have that space? And when we're talking about animals roaming across borders, do we have the capacity to get people to kind of agree across borders? So I'm from England, as I mentioned. London is one of the most densely populated cities in the world. There's about 9 million people in London. If you take a satellite photo of London, 47% of what that photo will reveal is green. So just let that sink in for a minute. 47% of one of the largest, most densely populated countries in the world looks green from above. And that's a combination of parks and yards and street trees and whatever, any sort of piece of green in the city. I give you that statistic because it's sort of surprising how much habitat is out there. And many of you, I think, will have heard of the 30 by 30 movement, which is in the news occasionally, and it basically means protecting 30% of the landscape at some level of protection, not national parks, but at some level of protection by 2030. And I think if you do protect 30% of the landscape, these species can go a long way to taking good advantage of that 30%. The oceans in particular are super interesting. If you close 30% of the oceans down to fishing, and if you think about how prolific fish are at reproduction, they literally, boom, they're back right away. So it's not ideal that, let's say, 70 or 80% of the world's surface is to some degree impacted by human activities. But I think what we've got left, if we help it recover and help protect it, can go a long way. And then let's add to that things like animal crossings. And it's super interesting living here just by Highway 93. Highway 93 has the biggest concentration of animal crossings of any highway in Montana. So we've got that animal bridge up by Grey Wolf Casino up there. The tribe, I don't know if you heard this, but just won another, I think it's $9 million to build another overpass near Nine Pipes. And that overpass will be for the grizzly bears that keep getting hit on 93. So animal crossings can go a long way to stitching those 30% fragments together. Better fence design can go a long way to helping animals. So when I was on the prairie, I talked to somebody whose specialty was fence ecology. I didn't know there was a thing called fence ecology. But you can build better and worse fences for wildlife. And if you build a fence with a smooth, lowest wire, then a pronghorn will just shimmy under that wire, because pronghorn like to do the limbo dance and go down under fences. And so I guess my answer to your question is it's not ideal that there's a lot of human impact on the landscape, but smart conservation moves, stitching things together, and just being intelligent about the infrastructure that we build, I think can go further than perhaps we imagined.
Do a few
Thank you again. For folks who are in the room, we have a few copies of Christopher's Tenacious Beasts book here. We don't have enough for everybody, so I apologize we couldn't get more ordered in time, but we will carry them in the gift shop here moving forward as well, so if you don't get one today, come back and see us. I also just wanted to, again, thank you for a thought-provoking great end to our series of winter storytelling this year. If you want to come up and meet Dexter, or his compatriot here, please do.